Hey everybody, welcome to our first video in this spring 2016 session of Life Groups. The first thing I want to say is just to thank you so much for your participation in our Life Groups. They are a key part of the health, and I believe in the future of our church. In the health of our church, because look, we just get so many people, a great percentage of our congregation is involved in Life Groups. And it really is very consciously a way that we make a big church small and try to connect with people on a very personal level. But also for the future of our church, look, we just think that there's so much potential for us to pour into what we do in our life groups and to use you, our life group leaders, as ways for us to really minister individually and personally to a big segment of our congregation as a whole. It's not exactly the same group that shows up on a Sunday morning, but man, it's sure bigger than what normally comes on a Wednesday night. And we're so excited about the work that you're doing with our life groups. So I want to encourage you that and thank you for that. The particular study that we're starting out with, the first week of life groups here, it's the fifth study in our series through the life of Joseph. And we're taking a look at this passage in Genesis chapter 39, verses 7 through 20, where Joseph resists the temptation of Potiphar's wife. It's a very vivid section, and of course, it's very relatable because it deals with resisting temptation. One thing that I would like you to do in your life groups this week is to kind of help me with something that I wasn't able to do with the Sunday message. On the Sunday message, and there were a few reasons why I did this, but on the Sunday message, I kept this pretty focused towards the idea of sexual temptation, which of course is a huge issue in our modern day. I don't have to tell you that. But I want you in your life group discussions to broaden the scale somewhat and make sure that we're talking about temptation in general, not only temptation to sexual immorality. Again, I think that's a very fair point to hammer home in the big picture, but by no means is it the only place. Look, let's face it, we face temptation in a lot of different spheres, so we don't want to be blind to the rest of it. So I'm going to kind of ask you to pick up on something that I left behind on the Sunday message and really make sure that the scope is broadened to consider temptation on all fronts. But what we have is this picture of Potiphar and her wife, and his wife, Potiphar's wife, I should say, and how she was very forward in her sexual seduction and attempt to entice Joseph. I listed a few different reasons why that was the case. I thought that it might have been just a very simple thing, that she felt deprived of her sexual desires, and man, there's no reason for anybody to feel deprived of anything, right? So, just going forth under that idea. And that deals with the first question that Pastor Lars dealt with in your Talk It Over sheet for life groups. How modern culture kind of tells us to pursue every sexual desire, but we know that that's really not the path toward either obedience to God or a healthy life. And so that's a good thing to talk about, how this sense of deprivation of desire, how the world tells us, well, no, you should never deprive yourself of any desire. We need to think a different way as believers. The second reason that I kind of talked about was Potiphar's wife came from a culture that was very permissive about these things. And we got to realize that the culture is not going to help us in our desire to resist sexual temptation. How we have to be strong and make a stand against what the culture would tell us. And that has to do somewhat with the second question Pastor Lars gave you about wanting to cross lines, things being attractive just because they're forbidden. Again, that's a very dominant message in our culture, and we need to be willing to break with that. Joseph's demeanor towards Potiphar's wife is also notable in this idea of how he managed his words towards her very carefully. And I really think that's a big deal. I think sometimes we as Christians, we don't give enough mind to speaking with propriety towards people in the opposite sex, that we shouldn't be joking about sexual matters or speaking to them about things that will open any kind of door for a sexualization of the relationship. I can just tell you this, and this is just kind of for your own background as life group leaders so that you know how seriously I take this. I talk with our staff, our male staff, pastors, regularly about the fact that in their interaction with people in the church and just in their daily conversation, they need to take a great deal of heed to not using flirtatious words, sexualizing the conversation, or bringing anything into it that would result in sort of opening a door for temptation that shouldn't be open. It's a very important point. We talked about the idea of how sexual temptations may be different for single Christians as for married, and how a single Christian should have an eye towards keeping something that the world despises, and that's innocence. So question number 4 really deals with that, and it's a good discussion to have about the married Christian and the single Christian and how the temptations might be somewhat different before them. Lars' other questions in 5, 6, and 7. Listen, these are great things to apply. Lars has done an excellent job this week in preparing you a question sheet. I just want you to be able to think about something as well when you work with it with your groups. I want you to think about how Potiphar's wife seems to be the kind of person who sees her identity in her sexuality. That's who she is. And I think that that's something for you to really discuss. Who are we? Should we define ourselves by our sexuality? And what are the dangers of that, setting that up as an idol in our life? And how would God have us pursue a better way, a more excellent way, rather than that terrible trap, I would say, of defining ourselves by our sexual desires and the fulfillment or the non-fulfillment of them? Listen, what we've given you this week in the sermon, in the text, in these study questions that Lars has given you, this is a target-rich environment. But I do ask you that you prayerfully consider just sort of the nature and the character of your life group. Some of you will be able to have a more open discussion about these things than others. You need to get a reading of sort of the tenor of your life group and not push them beyond a level that they're comfortable with, or at least not push them very far. It's okay for people to be a little bit uncomfortable and challenged with these things, but some of your groups may be much more reserved. You need to find a way, with the Holy Spirit helping you, to deal with these things without really stepping on toes, but at the same time stretching people to really examine these things in the light of the Scriptures. Look, what you guys talk about this week in your life groups, it's essential. This is discipleship at ground zero for us today. So I pray God's great blessing upon your time this week. And with Lars' questions and any questions you might have that you bring back to him in preparation for your time, it's going to be a great life group for you this week.